Jai Hind children, welcome to my YouTube channel SOS Study Point. Student, today I am here with a second chapter of snapshot book from class 11th, The Address. Student, today we will see here the story, the plot of this chapter, The Address, in detail. So let's see and start. Student, you can see this picture on your screen. The chapter The Address, which is written by Marga Minko. So now here, according to my instruction as I given you earlier in my video, first of all we will see about the author. So let's see about the author. So you know she belongs to a very Jewish family, Marga Minko. You know, this writer, this author was born in Chineken to an Orthodox Jewish family. Marga Minko began work as a trainee journalist on the Brandische Current in 1938, following the German invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940, and even before proclamation by the occupying forces of anti-Jewish measures. She was fired by order of the newspaper's German sympathizing board. Now, in the early part of the World War II, Minko lived in Breda, Amersfoort, and Amsterdam. She contracted a mild form of tuberculosis and ended up being treated in hospitals in Utrecht and Amersfoort. In the autumn of 1942, she returned to Amsterdam and her parents, who were forced by German occupiers to move into the city's Jewish quarter. Later in the war, Minko's parents, her brother, her sister were all deported. But having escaped arrest herself, she spent the rest of the war in hiding and was the family's only survivor. She also received a new name, Marga Fayez, the first part of which she continued to use. Minko married the poet and translator Bert Whiten, who died in 1992, whom she had met in 1938 and with whom she hid during the war. After the war, they worked on a number of newspapers and magazines. They have two daughters, one of whom is the writer Jessica Whiten. She turned 100 in March 2020. It means you can understand about the life of this author. So let's see about the lesson. Now student, you can see here this slide on your screen. This story is about the human predicament that follows the pre-war and post-war period. Mrs. S., who was a Jewish and a rich lady, whereas Mrs. Stalling was a non-Jewish. The girl, daughter of Mrs. S., had lost her house and her mother during the war, and now she had decided to come back to take her possessions from Mrs. Stalling, an acquaintance whose address was given by her mother years ago. When she reached the house, the woman treated her with a cold reception and didn't let her into the house. She decided to go back anyway, and then she met her daughter, who let her in and told her to wait inside. When she saw all the possessions in front of her. She couldn't connect with them and decided to leave the house. So, you can understand here about the character Mrs. S, Mrs. Darling, and someone else was there. So, let's see the character. Marga Minko, the narrator, she was a girl of 15 or 17. And Mrs. S, the narrator's mother, S, maybe Susan, Susanna, etc. Mrs. Darling, a very wicked, shrewd woman. She visited the narrator's mother, saying that she was her classmate years ago. So I hope you can understand about the character. Three major characters are here. This is the opening of the story. Before the war, the narrator's family was Jewish and Hitler was planning to kill all the Jews in Germany, Holland, Austria, etc. It appears that the narrator was away from home. Now, the next point is, we do not know if it was so or not. She offered to help the narrator's family by carrying their household utensils, furniture, and all other valuables. Next point, in fact, she had no intention to help the narrator's family. All she hoped was that the narrator's family die in the war and never return. The war was over and everyone except the narrator in the narrator's family was either deported, sent out of one's own country, or killed in the gas chambers. When the war was over and the Jews were feeling safe in these countries, Marga returned to her house and lived in a small hut. One day, Marga thought of the woman who had taken all her possessions. She remembered her address, 46 Marconi Street. This was the address of her house. Marga went to Marconi Street by train. So, student, these are the points which is the opening of the just before the war, in the opening of this story. So, with the help of this point, this story just began. Now, the next after the war, the first visit when she just visited to the house of Mrs. Darling. The narrator traces Mrs. Darling's number 46 address to claim her family's property. Now here, the narrator just reached at the house of Mrs. Darling at Marconi Street. Mrs. Darling refuses to give away. Now Mrs. Darling sees she doesn't recognize the narrator, but the narrator recognizes her. So this is very interesting line, because here Mrs. Darling was unable to recognize her, but the narrator just recognized her. It was now evident that Mrs. Darling had betrayed the narrator's mother. Marga was terribly pinched, hurt, disappointed, and betrayed. She was turning away to go when someone appeared at the window. Probably it was Mrs. Darling's daughter. She was asking, "Mom, who is there?" And Mrs. Darling gives a discouraging reply. That was how the first visit ended. So this was the first visit at the Marconi Street to the house of Mrs. Darling's number 46. The second visit of the narrator. The narrator grew impatient after a while, so she decided to visit Mrs. Darling once again. When she rang the bell at house number 46, Mrs. Darling was away. Mrs. Darling's daughter welcomed the narrator. The daughter had no idea how her mother had looted the utensils and furniture from the narrator's house. All that she knew was that her mother had bought these precious antiques on an auction. The daughter was proud of her. The daughter was proud of the expensive utensils and furniture. The narrator decides not to wait for Mrs. Darling. She leaves the house. She forgets the address. So these are the points related to the second visit of the narrator to the house of Mrs. Darling at number 46 Marconi Street. Now, this was not very easy to understand this story with the help of those points, but I know you can understand with the help of this summary. So let's start the summary of this chapter, this story. The story, the address, is all about the human predicament that follows the war. The story narrates how a daughter goes to her native place in Holland in search of mother's belongings after the war. Here the daughter of Mrs. S, it means the narrator, just went to the house of Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Darling's house. Here narrator knew about Mrs. Darling because her mother told her about her. At the beginning of the story, it is narrated how the protagonist was given a cold reception when she went to her native place after the war in search of her mother's belongings. After ringing the doorbell of Mrs. Darling, who lived at number 46 Marconi Street, the protagonist was given a cold reception and Mrs. Darling took much time to recognize her. So student, you can see here protagonist. Here protagonist is the Mrs. S daughter. It means the narrator. So here you can see the word protagonist. Mrs. Darling had thought everyone in the protagonist family was dead. So Mrs. Darling was expecting that the family member of Mrs. S were dead in the war, but she asked if anyone else had come along with her. Mrs. Darling refused to let the protagonist inside her home and told her to come back sometime later. Means here, after the searching the address of Mrs. Darling, the narrator reached at the house of Mrs. Darling, number 46 at Marconi Street, but she don't let her come inside the house. That is why Mrs. Darling refused to let the protagonist inside her home and told her to come back sometimes later. The protagonist recognized her mother's green cardigan, which means Darling was wearing. So here protagonist, the narrator, just recognized her mother's belonging which was there. She decided to go back to the train station and thought about her mother and how she told her about Mrs. Darling, who was an acquaintance of hers. Means now she was very sad. She was very sad after looking that cardigan that was of green color. She was very sad. She was feeling very sad. That is why she decided to go back. She'd never come back here again. But now, during the war, Mrs. Darling would visit their house and take their possession with her, as she didn't want them to get lost. If they ever left the place, Mrs. Darling had a brought back. So here with the help of this line, Mrs. Darling just had a brought back, but she always come to the Mrs. S house for asking for the possession and also belongings item to Mrs. S, because she knew very well in this world war every Jewish family will be killed by the officers. That is why she just want all the belongings of Mrs. S. That is why she asking every time. Now the protagonist decided to go to Mrs. Darling's home to get back their belongings. When she rang the bell, Mrs. Darling's daughter. Now this is the second time, this is the second visit of the narrator to the house of Mrs. Darling, but there was absence. I mean to say, when she just rang the bell, then Mrs. Darling's daughter was there. Mrs. Darling was not there. She was absent that time. But she let her in and asked her to wait in the living room. When she asked about her mother, then the daughter of Mrs. Darling just tell her to wait here in the living room. When they were crossing the passage, the protagonist noticed their Hanukkah candle stand that they had never used because it had been unmanageable. When she reached the living room, she was horrified as she saw all her mother's things that were arranged in a tasteless manner. Means now this time narrators just have a glance to everything which was used in her house also. Now that things are here in the house of Mrs. Darling, but not in the manner of arranging manner. It was in the tasteless manner. The furniture was ugly and the room had a muggy smell, and it made her disinterested and she wanted to leave the place. Mrs. Darling's daughter offered her a cup of tea, and the protagonist noticed the old tablecloth that had a burn mark on it. So she just remembered that time how the cloth had been burned. So she saw that burn mark on that cloth which was just covered on the table of Mrs. Darling. When the girl was showing her the silver fork and spoons that actually belongs to the protagonist, she jumped up and walked out of the house. So now she was being irritated with the scene of that thing. She decided not to visit the place again as it brought back memories of the past, and hence she decided to forget the address. Now here she was very afraid, she was very sad with the looking of that things, with the seeing of that things which was in the house of Mrs. Darling, because everything was just giving her back the memories of her mother. And that time which was when that time the war was begun. So that's why here the narrator, the protagonist of the story, did not want to remember that scene. So student, this is the story, this is the summary of the story. So I hope you can understand with the help of this video. So just take help with your textbook, and this is very interesting story. So if you have any problem related with this topic, then you can comment me in my comment section box, in this video comment section box. So I hope you can understand. So let's bye, have a nice day, goodbye student.